The nation is mourning the loss of longtime civil rights activist and former NAACP chairman Julian Bond. He died at the age of 75 after a brief illness. In addition to helping lead the fight against racism, Mr. Bond became the first African American who was nominated as vice president during the 1968 election. Of course, he was nominated and had to withdraw because he wasn't quite old enough yet. 2 years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Mr. Bond during the National Day of Courage celebration at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. Joining me now is social activist, writer, professor, and former president of the NAACP, Julian Bond. Welcome to Detroit, and welcome to the Henry Ford Museum.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's very nice to meet you. Let's talk about what was going on in 1955 when Rosa Parks does what she does on that bus. I think a lot of people think this was the first thing that happened, or the first part of the civil rights movement. But actually, there was a lot of momentum already starting to build up in the South.
A lot of momentum building up in the South, a lot of activity, a lot of NAACP chapters across the region active and fighting for voter registration, fighting for this, fighting for that. At least 2 women before Rosa Parks had been arrested on the bus. But Rosa Parks is the first person to plead not guilty,
right,
and therefore trigger a court case that resulted in integration of the buses. So she's a true heroine of all this story.
Right.
Somebody said to me, Martin Luther King didn't make Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks made Martin Luther King.
Right. And so what part of this movement were you involved in at that point?
When Rosa Parks was sitting on the bus, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and just trying to mind my own business, going to school. But in 1960, I became involved in the sit-in movement and helped to found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and later worked for them for 5 years.
Right, right. This is the 9 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 10 years before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. What was it about this particular event that seemed to catapult this, toward actual change?
Well, the Montgomery bus boycott was like a trigger. Like, people outside of Montgomery said, oh, we can do that. We can do that. If they did it there, we can do this here. Or said, if they can act in this way, we can act in this way. It opened the door for a lot of people to say, I can be involved in this movement. I don't have to be an enormous speaker like Dr. King. I don't have to be, all I have to have is a little courage.
Right.
And Rosa Parks proved what courage was.
Right. And as you point out, you had a little of that courage yourself at Atlanta City Hall.
Very
well, I think I would say a little more than a little, but in Atlanta City Hall, you participated in a sit-in to desegregate the cafeteria, the restaurant.
Right. There was a cafeteria in the basement of the Atlanta City Hall, and I led a group of my fellow students from the Atlanta University Center into this restaurant, and we walked past the steam tables, which were manned by black women serving the food, and they were surprised to see us. A mixture of happiness to see us because they knew about sit-ins in other cities, and a little fear because they knew if we were there, the police would soon be there. They didn't want to be around police. We went through the line. I came up to the white woman who was a cashier, and she said, I'm awfully sorry, this is for City Hall employees only. I said, you have a big sign out front that says City Hall Cafeteria, the public is welcome. She said, we don't mean it. I said, well, I will stay here until you do, and she called the police, and the police came and took us away.
Right, and that for you launched a very long career and struggle in the civil rights movement.
Yes, that was my first step, and I've been trying to step along ever since.
Right. The Georgia legislature, for example, when you were elected, refused to seat you.
Refused to seat me because I had endorsed a statement opposing the war in Vietnam. Well, I thought that was my constitutional right to have opinions about things, but the Georgia legislature disagreed, and they threw me out, declared my seat vacant. I ran for the vacancy. I won the election. They threw me out again. I ran again to fill my own vacancy, and eventually the Supreme Court decided that I was right, the Georgia legislature was wrong, I'm sorry, and I served for the next 20 years.
Right, and that sort of going back over and over again, not taking no for an answer, not accepting the idea that that you're a second-class citizen, that really was at the core of the idea of the civil rights movement, and continues into today.
Absolutely, the idea that you have rights, and you're going to exercise these rights, and you're going to demand that others respect your rights, just as a hallmark of the movement. Now, not everybody, sat in, not everybody marched, not everybody participated, but the list of participants is enormous, and it's hard to go into any section of the South, at least, and talk to black people of a certain age not to find somebody who did something in this movement.
Right. You're a college professor even today lecturing young people. What do you see in 18, 19, 20-year-olds today that reminds you of the things that you were doing back in the 1960s?
Well, even though I don't think it's always apparent to everyone, they are tremendously engaged in social movements of various kinds, some of which didn't exist when I was coming along. The movement of gay and lesbian rights, for example,
right.
while existing, was a very minor thing on the horizon. Most people didn't know anything at all about it, would have been surprised to hear it existed. But my students are engaged in that. And just the endless list of causes and concerns that grab them, and thankfully they're
participants
in them and they're moving along.
And do you see those movements now as natural outgrowths of the civil rights movement?
Natural outlooks of the civil rights movement, natural things that followed. You look at the women's movement, which is an old movement in this country.
Right.
The civil rights movement gave it some impetus.
Right.
As women went from the civil rights movement back into the women's movement, didn't begin it, it was already existing, but back into it and kept it going.
Yeah. I read a quote from you recently, and this was in 2010, after the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president, I believe. And I thought it was a wonderful way to put it. You said, "Those who say race is history have it exactly backwards. History is race, and America is race from its symbolism to its substance." 4 years later, or almost 4 years later, do you still think those words?
Absolutely. You know, the peculiar thing about the election of President Obama is that in some regards it both signaled a new racial tolerance in the country and engineered a kind of steps backward in the country. Racial enmity, according to public polls, has increased since he became president rather than decreased. So it's a real mixed blessing here.
Right, right. You also said at that time that most people, when they think of the civil rights movement now, most young people think of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. They don't really think of the broader context of that movement, and that we've really got to widen our familiarity with the people and the events that
right,
shaped
and the
that.
Southern Poverty Law Center, you know, conducted a survey of how states do in teaching civil rights history. I wish I could remember how Michigan did. I'm sure it did very well.
I hope so.
But some states did awfully badly. Depending on the percentage of black people in the state, the better they did. But it's that's almost a sad because it sounds like if we have black people, we have to teach this subject.
Right.
If you don't have black people, we don't have to teach it. Everybody needs to know civil rights history.
Right. Do you see a difference now in the South versus the North in terms
absolutely,
of
absolutely.
acceptance
A tremendous
of that
difference.
movement?
Tremendous difference. You can do things. I can do things in the South I couldn't have dreamed of doing
Sure.
when I was your age or younger. So it changes everywhere.
Right, right. You have encouraged young African Americans to join civil rights organizations to keep this movement alive. Is that a hard sell in an era where they see an African American in the White House?
Yes and no. It's a hard sell because they say, well, these problems are over. We don't have to sit in the back of the bus. We don't have to march. We don't have to protest. Of course, we have to do all those things. There's still racial divides in this country between black and white, and they need to be closed. And the only way they're going to be closed is if people, young, old, black, white, of every race and color, decide to push against them and make them change.
Right. Is the president's second term maybe an opportunity for him to rally people more to that cause than he did initially in that first term?
You hope so. You hope so.
You hope so. Yeah. And he certainly has stepped out on the gay rights issue.
Well, yeah, the gay rights issue, on climate change, which none of the candidates mentioned in the last election.
Right.
Just amazing. And none of them were asked about it in the last election, but he spoke about it in his inaugural address.
Right, right. And that for you to stand and watch a black man be inaugurated as the President of the United States for a second time must have been a particularly
Oh yes, because
moment.
I think the second election was more telling than the first election.
Because
it's one thing to get elected the first time, and then to go through this long period of opposition, that his opponents, determined from the very first day to make him a failure, and did everything they could to put barriers in his way, for him to have overcome that and win such a resounding election. When George Bush got that kind of vote, he was said to have had a mandate.
Right.
When Obama got that kind of second vote, they started a secession movement.
Yeah, right. That's right. Apples and oranges still.
Yes.
Yeah. Great to have you here.
My
Wonderful
pleasure.
day for the country.
It's a wonderful place. I can't understand why more people don't come.
Yes, this is a jewel here in southeast Michigan.